Welcome to day 2 of learning about complex sentences. Today, specifically, we're going to talk about complex sentences and punctuation. Our lesson goal is that we will be able to recognize dependent clauses and write complex sentences with correct punctuation. As a review, an independent clause is another name for a simple sentence or complete thought. It has all the information that it needs to stand alone. A dependent clause is half a thought. It almost looks like a sentence, but you're missing information. It fails the guess what test. A complex sentence is a sentence that has one dependent and one independent clause. As a review, the guess what test is what we use to figure out if something is independent or dependent. If you aren't sure if a clause is independent or dependent, you use the guess what test to check. If it makes sense, it's independent. If it doesn't, it's dependent. Hey Sarah, guess what? Sarah says, what? Until I bring my grade up to passing. Sarah's going to wait a second. She's going to look at Sally, and then eventually she's going to say, what? What are you doing until you bring your grade up to passing? Are you grounded? Are you going to tutorials? Are you studying? What's happening until you bring your grade up to passing? That lets us know that this phrase is dependent. So let's practice. Is this independent or dependent? Although I made her the most delicious chocolate cake in existence. Although means that this is dependent. My mother still decided to ground me. This one is independent. The tree growing in the green field beside the old elementary school gym blew over last night in the ferocious storm. Wow, that's a lot of information, but if I simplify this, the tree that's beside the old gym blew over last night when there was a storm. It sounds like I have all my information. I don't see a subordinating conjunction. I don't see a word that lets me know I'm missing information. So this one is independent. Even though I have always followed all the insanely boring and extremely annoying elementary school rules. Okay, again, this is a lot of information, but let's simplify. Even though I have always followed all the school rules. Well, what happened even though you have always followed all the school rules? Even though makes this clause dependent. While I watched the most anticipated new movie of the year at AMC theaters, what happened while you watched the movie? We don't know. While means this clause is dependent. So let's practice a little bit more. I have 3 clauses at the bottom of the screen. Because he wanted to return his book to the library. Since I love fashion. On Wednesdays, we always go grocery shopping for the week. Whenever you see your neighbor again. Which one of these are independent and which one of these are dependent? Pause the video if you need time to think. Let's see if you got it right. Because he wanted to return his book to the library is dependent. Because is a subordinating conjunction. It's a word that makes the clause dependent. Since I love fashion is dependent. Since is a subordinating conjunction, it lets us know that we're missing information, so it's dependent. On Wednesdays, we always go grocery shopping for the week. We have all our information there. That's an independent clause. Whenever you see your neighbor again, whenever is a subordinating conjunction. It's a word that lets us know we're missing information because we don't know what you need to do whenever you see your neighbor again. As a review, a complex sentence has one dependent and one independent clause. As an example, when you finish your test, is dependent. You may read your library book is independent. I will not be happy if my basketball team loses their game today. I will not be happy is independent. If my basketball team loses their game today is dependent. Think of a complex sentence like a grandmother watching a little girl. The independent clause is the grandmother. She's all grown up. She is independent. She can do everything by herself. The little girl is dependent. There are things that she doesn't know how to do yet that she's dependent on her adult to help her with. She can't live all alone. So grandma is babysitting because mom and dad went to a wedding. Grandma is babysitting is my independent clause. If I leave it by itself, grandma is babysitting, it will be fine. Because mom and dad went to a wedding is my dependent clause. There's information missing. It can't stay by itself because then it will be missing information. So it's the little girl, it's the dependent clause. Everyone should vote in the election since it's their responsibility as a citizen. Again, my independent clause is independent. It's all grown up. It can do its business by itself. It doesn't need anybody else. So grandma is my independent clause. Everyone should vote in the election. That's independent because it makes sense all by itself. The little girl is dependent because she's dependent on an adult to help her. She can't live or stand all by herself. So my dependent clause is since it's their responsibility as a citizen. If I took everything else away in the sentence and all I said was since it's their responsibility as a citizen, that wouldn't make sense by itself. So that's dependent. As soon as we get home, Grandma will make me cookies. As soon as we get home is dependent. The little girl's in the front. Grandma will make me cookies is independent. Do you notice something in the sentence that we didn't have in the last sentence? Now that the little girl's in front, I see something different. Now we have a comma. Think of it this way. When the grandma's in front, the grandma's in the lead, she knows what she's doing, she doesn't need any help. But if the little girl is trying to lead, grandma still has to hold her hand to make sure she doesn't get into any trouble. The comma is connecting that dependent clause to the independent clause. If the dependent clause, the little girl is leading, you need a comma to make sure it's connected to the independent clause. So here's another example. Unless she takes her nap, Jenny is cranky in the afternoon. Unless she takes her nap is dependent. It doesn't make sense by itself. It can't go anywhere alone. Jenny is cranky in the afternoon is independent. Grandma can go places alone if she wants to. Jenny is cranky in the afternoon is a sentence. If you leave it by itself without everything else on the screen, it'll be fine. We need a comma because the dependent clause is in the front. The little girl is leading. The dependent clause is in front of the independent clause, so we need a comma. So here's our rule for punctuating complex sentences. If the sentence starts with the dependent clause, you need a comma at the end of the dependent clause. If the sentence starts with the independent clause, you don't need a comma. So again, if the dependent clause, the little girl, is at the front of the sentence, you need a comma at the end of the dependent clause. If the sentence starts with the independent clause, so grandma's in the lead, you don't need any comma. If the independent clause is the leader, no comma because grandma knows what to do. If the dependent clause is the leader, put a comma at the end of the clause because the little girl needs to hold grandma's hand. Okay, let's review what we've learned today. An independent clause is a complete thought. A dependent clause is half a thought that doesn't pass the guess what test. A complex sentence has one dependent clause and one independent clause. In a complex sentence, if the dependent clause is first, you need a comma at the end of the dependent clause. But if the independent clause is first, you don't need a comma.